The moment the curtain fell, Marin knew her life was over. Hundreds of eyes turned. The music stopped. And for the first time in years, she wasn't hidden anymore. But what terrified her most wasn't the crowd. It was the man already watching her from the shadows. Because this wasn't an accident. He planned it. The royal ballroom of Lumina Bay was a cage made of gold and expensive glass. Inside, the air smelled of lilies and old money. Marin Peter stood in the one corner the light could not reach. She was hidden behind a thick velvet curtain that smelled of dust and secrets. To the hundreds of guests dancing on the marble floor, Marin did not exist. She was a ghost with a violin. On the brightly lit stage, a princess moved her bow in a perfect mimicry of Marin's movements. The crowd cheered for the princess, but the soul of the music came from the girl in the shadows. Marin's fingers moved with a speed that felt like a heartbeat. Every note was a prayer for her family. 10 years ago, her father had made a mistake. He had borrowed money from the wrong men to save his failing music school. In the world of the Shin syndicate, debts do not die with the person who signs the paper. They follow the blood. When her father passed away, the debt landed on Marin's shoulders like a mountain of iron. She wasn't just playing for the music anymore. She was playing to keep her mother from losing their home. She was a virtuoso trapped in a silent contract. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open. The music didn't stop, but the temperature of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Shin walked in. He did not look like a criminal. He looked like a king in a suit that cost more than Marin's entire life. But he was a king under watch. 2 men in plain gray suits followed him exactly 3 steps behind. They were federal agents, and their eyes never left the back of Caleb's head. Caleb was under soft arrest, a tiger allowed to attend a party while the hunters held the leash. Caleb did not look at the bride. He did not look at the diamonds or the champagne. His dark eyes fixed on the velvet curtain in the corner. He could hear the truth in the music. He knew the princess on stage was a fraud, and he knew exactly who was providing the magic. He adjusted his silver cufflinks and gave a small, almost invisible nod to a waiter standing near the wall. Marin felt a sudden draft of cold air. Before she could finish the final high note of her solo, there was a sharp mechanical click. The golden ropes holding the velvet curtain snapped. The heavy fabric gathered speed and fell to the floor in a heap of red dust. The music stopped with a jagged screech. Marin stood frozen in the sudden, blinding spotlight, her old, faded dress clashing with the glittering jewels of the women who were now pointing and laughing. The velvet curtain hit the floor with a heavy thud, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Marin Peter stood frozen, her bow still resting against the strings of her violin. The bright, golden lights of the chandeliers felt like a physical weight on her shoulders. For a second, the entire ballroom was silent. Then, the whispering began. It started as a low hum and grew into a wave of cruel laughter. On the stage, the princess turned pale, her fake violin hanging uselessly at her side. She looked at Marin with pure hatred, not because she felt bad, but because the lie was over. The wealthy guests leaned in, pointing their diamond-covered fingers at Marin's faded cotton dress. It was a simple navy blue, worn thin at the elbows, and it looked like a dark stain against the sea of silk and white lace. "Who is this girl?" a woman in a tiara asked, her voice dripping with disgust. "She looks like she wandered in from the street. Is this some kind of joke?" Marin's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like lead. She clutched her violin to her chest, the wood cool against her shaking palms. This instrument was the only thing she owned that was worth anything, and now it felt like a target. She saw the socialites shaking their heads, their eyes full of judgment. To them, she wasn't a musician, she was an imposter who had ruined their perfect view. The 2 agents in gray suits reacted instantly. They didn't care about the music or the drama, they only cared about security. They stepped away from Shin, their hands moving toward the radios on their belts. To them, a girl hiding behind a curtain was a potential threat to the royal family. They moved through the crowd with practiced speed, pushing past the guests to reach the corner where Marin stood. "Identify yourself," the lead agent barked. His voice was cold and loud, cutting through the laughter of the guests. "You are not on the guest list. You are trespassing on royal property." Marin tried to speak, but her throat was dry. She looked around for the manager who had hired her, but he had vanished into the shadows. She was alone. The agents reached her, their shadows falling over her small frame. One of them reached out to grab her arm, his face set in a hard line. Marin closed her eyes, waiting for the cold metal of handcuffs, but the hand never touched her. Instead, a shadow even larger and darker than the agent stepped between them. The agent's hand stopped just inches from Marin's shoulder. A cold, steady voice cut through the noise of the ballroom like a knife through silk. "I would suggest you take a step back," Shin said. He didn't shout, but his voice had a weight to it that made the air feel heavy. The guests stopped whispering, and the two agents turned around, their faces tight with annoyance. Caleb stood between Marin and the men in gray suits, looking like a mountain that no one could move. The lead agent narrowed his eyes. "Mr. Shin, this girl is not on the manifest. She was hiding behind a curtain in a restricted area. We are removing her for questioning." Caleb didn't reach for a pocket or a folder. Instead, he calmly tapped the screen of the agent's own security tablet. "Check your registry, gentlemen," Caleb said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "I had my attorneys upload the guardianship filings to the royal database 2 months ago. I don't leave my assets to chance." The agent frowned and swiped his finger across the tablet screen. His face turned pale as a set of official documents appeared, stamped with the seal of the High Court. The dates were old and perfectly legal. Marin Peter was listed clearly as a legal ward of the Shin estate. There was no legal way to argue. "Our apologies, Mr. Shin," the leader muttered, staring at the screen in disbelief. "We didn't know you had family matters to attend to." They backed into the crowd, though their eyes remained fixed on Caleb from a distance. Marin felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it only lasted for a second. As the agents walked away, she looked up at Caleb. He wasn't looking at her with kindness or worry. His eyes were hard, calculating, and completely cold. He hadn't just saved her because he was a good person. He had planted those digital files months ago, waiting for the perfect moment to trap her in the spotlight. Marin realized with a jolt of terror that this was not an accident. Caleb had known the curtain would fall. He had known the agents would move in. He had staged this entire scene just to link her name to his in front of everyone. She wasn't just a girl with a debt anymore, she was now his legal shadow, trapped in a spotlight he had created. Before she could speak, he leaned down, his breath cold against her ear. "Don't look at the exit, Marin," he whispered. "You're with me now. And we have work to do." The orchestra began to play a slow, heavy waltz that echoed off the high ceiling. Caleb did not wait for Marin to agree. He led her toward the floor, but stopped at a small side table near the orchestra. "Leave the instrument," he commanded. "You can't dance with a piece of wood in your arms." Marin hesitated, her fingers clutching the neck of the violin. "It's the only thing I have left," she whispered. "It's a distraction," Caleb replied, his eyes cold. "If you're holding that, you're a musician. If your hands are empty, you're a ghost. Put it down." Marin placed the violin in its open case on the chair. As they stepped onto the marble, Caleb leaned in. "Not in front of all these people, Mr. Shin," Marin whispered, her voice trembling. "The agents, the Duchess, everyone is watching." Caleb didn't look at her. He kept his chin high and his expression as hard as a statue. "Then learn fast," he replied. He placed a heavy hand on her waist and forced her to move. It wasn't a romantic dance, it was a march. Caleb moved with a stiff, wooden rhythm, his boots clicking sharply against the floor. Marin realized with a start that the most dangerous man in the city had no sense of music at all. She had to use all her strength to lead him, sliding her feet to keep him from stepping on her toes. As they spun slowly toward the head table, Caleb leaned his head down, hiding his lips from the microphones. "Every camera in this room is focused on my hands, Marin," he growled. "If I even reach for a napkin, 3 agents will tackle me. But you? You are the ghost. You have no file, no record, and the only clean hands in this building. That is why you are here." He nodded toward the head table. "Look at the man in the purple robes. That is Bishop Miller. In his left pocket is a silver microdrive. I will spin you past him. You have 5 seconds to take it. If you fail, the debt doubles, and you will belong to the syndicate forever." Marin's breath hitched. She looked toward the table and saw an older man laughing with a glass of champagne in his hand. He looked important and untouchable. "We are going to pass him on the next turn," Caleb continued, his grip tightening until it almost hurt. "I will spin you close enough to brush against his side. You have 5 seconds to take that drive. If your hands shake, or if you fail to grab it, your father's debt doubles tonight. You will be working for the Shin syndicate for the rest of your life." Marin looked at the bishop, then back at Caleb's icy eyes. She wasn't just a musician anymore, she was a thief in a den of lions. The music grew louder, reaching a sharp crescendo as they neared the target. Her fingers twitching with a nervous energy she had only felt before a world-class solo. She had 5 seconds to change her life or lose it forever. The orchestra shifted into a fast, frantic melody. The lead violinist on stage began a solo that raced up and down the scales, filling the room with a sharp, nervous energy. This was the moment Caleb had been waiting for. He didn't change his expression, but Marin felt his muscles tighten like a spring. The rhythm of the waltz grew quicker, and the floor seemed to tilt as Caleb steered her toward the head table. "Get ready," Caleb whispered, his voice as cold as the marble beneath them. Marin's heart hammered against her ribs so hard it felt like it would break. She looked at the bishop, who was leaning back and laughing at a joke. His heavy silk robes draped over the side of his chair, perfectly still. Marin knew she only had one chance. If she missed the pocket, or if the bishop felt her touch, Caleb would not protect her. He would let the guards take her, and her family's debt would grow into a cage she could never escape. Caleb executed a sudden, sharp turn. He used his large frame to block the view of the federal agents and the security cameras. For a split second, Marin was swung directly against the bishop's chair. Her shoulder brushed against the expensive fabric of his robes. This was what she had trained for her entire life, though she hadn't known it. Years of playing the most difficult music in the world had given her fingers a life of their own. They were fast, precise, and lighter than a feather. As Caleb spun her, Marin's hand shot out. Her fingers dipped into the bishop's deep pocket with the same grace she used to pluck a violin string. She felt the cold, hard edges of the silver microdrive. With a tiny flick of her wrist, she pulled the small object out and tucked it into the palm of her hand. The bishop didn't even blink. He continued his laugh, completely unaware that the keys to the city had just been stolen from him. Caleb pulled her back into the center of the floor, his grip like a vice. Marin kept her fist clenched tight, her thumb pressing the metal drive against her skin. She was shaking so much that she feared the guests would see her trembling, but the dance did not stop. They were still moving, still spinning, and the music was still screaming. But as she looked over Caleb's shoulder, she saw the lead agent in the gray suit stop walking. He wasn't watching the crowd anymore. He was staring directly at Marin's closed hand. The lead agent did not look away. His eyes were like cold gray stones, fixed entirely on Marin's right hand. He began to march across the floor, pushing past a duke and a princess without a word of apology. Marin felt the silver microdrive cutting into her palm. Her heart was beating so fast that she felt dizzy. If the agent reached her now, he would see the metal glinting between her fingers, and her life would be over. Caleb felt the change in the air before Marin did. He didn't turn his head to look at the approaching agent. Instead, he suddenly stopped the dance. He didn't let go of Marin's hand, but his grip changed from a firm lead to a rough, angry yank. "I told you to keep your head up," Caleb suddenly roared. His voice was so loud and so full of ice that the nearby guests jumped in fright. The music of the orchestra seemed to stumble as his anger filled the room. The lead agent stopped just 3 feet away, his hand hovering over his belt. He looked confused. He had expected a secret handoff, but instead, he was witnessing a private explosion of mafia temper. "Mr. Shin," the agent asked, his voice cautious. "Is there a problem with your ward?" Caleb turned to the agent, his eyes filled with a terrifying, dark promise. "The problem is that she is a Peter," Caleb spat, using Marin's last name like a curse. "She has no grace. She is clumsy, she is slow, and she is wasting my time on this floor. She belongs in the shadows, not in the light." He looked back at Marin, his face twisted in a fake scowl. "Go," he commanded, pointing a finger toward her violin case sitting in the corner. "Fix your hair. Fix your face. Do not return until you can walk without tripping over your own feet." Marin didn't wait. She put her head down, pretending to sob into her free hand. As she turned away, she used the cover of her crying to slip the microdrive deep into the velvet lining of her violin case. The lead agent watched her go, but his attention was quickly snapped back to Caleb, who stepped into the agent's personal space. Caleb was acting like a man who was ready to start a war over a ruined dance, and the agent was too busy dealing with the Shadow King's fury to notice the girl in the blue dress. The bishop's shout rang out, and the heavy doors slammed shut with a boom. "Lockdown," a guard yelled. The music died instantly, replaced by the sound of shouting and heavy boots. Marin stood in the middle of the floor with Caleb, completely exposed. The guards were already starting to search people where they stood, moving row by row. "We have to get to the chair," Caleb muttered. He didn't run, he walked with a calm, terrifying slowness toward the corner where her violin sat. He used his massive frame to shield her from the cameras. By the time the agents reached them, she was simply a scared girl clutching her music. "They are going to search me first," Caleb warned, his eyes like hard flint. "They expect the mafia boss to be the thief. They see a dangerous man, but they only see a girl with a song. Hold your instrument tight, Marin. They won't search the girl with the music." The lead agent pushed through the crowd, his silver handcuffs glinting. He grabbed Caleb's arm, but his eyes stayed on Marin for a long, suspicious moment. "Both of you. To the exit," he barked. "No one leaves this palace without a full body sweep." Marin clutched the neck of her violin, her knuckles turning white. As the guards began to march them toward the heavy iron gates of the palace courtyard, she realized the hardest part of the night was only just beginning. The grand celebration began to fade as the heavy palace doors were finally opened for the guests to leave. The night air was cool and smelled of salt from the nearby harbor, but Marin could not enjoy the breeze. Her hand was locked onto the handle of her violin case so tightly that her fingers felt numb. Inside that wooden box, hidden in a tiny gap no one would ever think to check, sat the silver drive that could destroy everyone in the room. Caleb Shin walked beside her, his footsteps heavy and steady on the stone path. He did not look at her, and he did not speak. He kept his eyes fixed on the line of security guards and federal agents waiting at the main gate. They stood next to tall metal detectors that hummed with a low, threatening sound. As they reached the front of the line, the lead agent stepped forward, blocking Caleb's path with a cold smile. "Step aside, Mr. Shin," the agent said, his voice full of a dark kind of joy. "We need to be sure you aren't carrying any royal souvenirs." The agents did not just scan Caleb, they searched him with a rough, aggressive energy. They checked his silk pockets and even the lining of his coat. Caleb stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the head guard sitting behind the security monitor. As the agent moved a handheld sensor over Caleb's chest, Caleb caught the guard's eye and gave a single, sharp nod. A week ago, a large sum of money had moved from Caleb's bank to that guard's private account. It was the price of a 3-second glitch. "Your turn, girl," the agent muttered, waving Marin toward the tall sensors. Marin stepped forward, her heart hammer drilling against her ribs. She clutched the violin case tight. As she walked between the humming pillars, the guard behind the desk leaned back, his hand accidentally brushing the power switch. The lights on the machine flickered off for a heartbeat. Marin passed through in total silence. The machine didn't beep, not because it was broken, but because Caleb Shin had bought the silence of the man running it. The sensor stayed silent. Marin kept walking, her feet moving across the gravel until she reached the edge of the harbor. She didn't look back until she felt the shadow of Caleb Shin fall over her again. The lights of the palace were behind them now, and the dark water of the bay was waiting. The door of the heavy black sedan shut with a soft click, cutting off the sounds of the harbor and the distant music of the wedding. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of expensive leather. Marin sat in the deep back seat, her violin case resting on her lap like a shield. She watched the palace lights grow smaller in the window as the car pulled away. Beside her, Caleb Shin sat in total silence. He looked out at the dark water of the bay, his face as still as a statue. After a few minutes, Caleb reached into his coat. Marin flinched, her heart skipping a beat, but he didn't pull out a weapon. The digital files were for the courts, Caleb said quietly. But your father signed this with his own hand. I kept the original. Instead, he held a piece of yellow paper that looked very old. Marin recognized the messy handwriting at the bottom instantly. It was her father's signature. This was the marker, the legal chain that had kept her family in fear for 10 long years. To the rest of the world, it was just a scrap of paper, but to Marin, it was the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. Caleb looked at the paper for a moment, then looked at Marin. For the first time all night, the ice in his eyes seemed to melt just a little bit. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver lighter. With a flick of his thumb, a bright orange flame danced in the dark car. He held the edge of the debt paper to the fire. Marin watched, breathless, as the flame climbed the page. The black ink curled and vanished into gray smoke. The smell of burning paper filled the small space, but to Marin, it smelled like freedom. Caleb held the paper until the fire almost touched his fingers, then he dropped the glowing ashes into a small tray. You did well tonight, Marin, Caleb said. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. The syndicate does not forget its debts, but it also knows when a person has paid enough. My men will stay away from your mother's house. Your family is safe now. Marin looked at the pile of gray ash, unable to believe it was over. Why, she asked, her voice cracking. You could have kept me as your ghost forever. Caleb turned back to the window, the city lights reflecting in his dark eyes. Because the world is full of people who lie and pretend, he replied. But when you play that violin, you are the only thing that is real. You are too good a musician to spend your life hiding behind a curtain. You were born to be seen. The car began to slow down as they reached the familiar, quiet street where Marin lived. She looked at the small house with the porch light on, knowing that tonight, for the first time in a decade, she would finally be able to sleep. 1 year had passed since the night of the royal wedding, but the Lumina Opera House felt like a completely different world. The air was not heavy with secrets or the smell of dust. Instead, it was filled with the sweet scent of expensive perfume and the excited chatter of a sold-out crowd. Marin Peter stood in the center of the stage, the bright spotlights shining down on her like a warm hug. She was no longer a ghost hiding behind a red velvet curtain. She was the first chair, the lead violinist, and her name was printed in gold letters on every program in the hall. She lifted her violin to her shoulder, the same instrument that had once hidden a dangerous secret. Her fingers moved across the strings with a joy she had never felt before. The music she played was not a lie for a princess, it was her own story. The notes soared through the high rafters, telling a tale of shadows, debts, and the courage it took to finally step into the light. When she reached the final, soaring note of her solo, the entire room went silent for a single, magical heartbeat. Then, the applause broke out like a thunderclap. Thousands of people rose to their feet, cheering and shouting her name. Marin lowered her bow, her breath coming in short, happy gasps. She looked out at the sea of faces, her eyes searching the high VIP boxes that lined the walls. In the very center box, a man sat alone in the shadows. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo like the other guests. He wore a simple, dark suit that made him look like a piece of the night itself. It was Caleb Shin. He didn't smile, and he didn't cheer, but as the rest of the crowd settled back into their seats, he did something Marin had never seen him do. He stood up. He was the only person in the entire theater still standing, his tall frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the velvet chairs. He looked down at her with a look of quiet pride, acknowledging the girl who had once been his ward and was now a master of her own fate. Marin smiled at him, a real smile that reached her eyes. She knew that Caleb still couldn't dance, and he would likely always be a man of the shadows. But as the curtains finally began to close, she realized she wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. She had paid her debts, she had found her voice, and for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be.